Okay, so we've sort of got through a lot of material so far. Once again, if you didn't take a break yet, this would be a great time to take one, but I'm assuming you did, so let's jump right into it. And we're going to be looking at inline block. We've looked at inline elements, we've looked at block elements. Inline block is sort of the best of both worlds because sometimes, because as we saw, when we have something that's inline, it can't have a margin on the top and the bottom of it. It can't have padding, or it sort of does, but it's buggy because it overlaps other content. But we can set all those things on a block element, but the block element always creates new lines of text. A paragraph will always be on the next line, a new div, all of those things, they force a new line. Sometimes we need things that stay in line, like a link, but we need to be able to set margins and padding on it. And we can do that by changing its display property to inline block. The most common use case for something like this is creating buttons. So we're going to take this layout that we've already looked at when we were doing our links, and we're going to change those two bottom links into buttons instead of being regular links. And we're going to see why the inline block works and sort of the basics of setting up a button like this. And in the next video, I'm going to give you some best practice when it comes to actually styling buttons and making buttons look good. So right now, if you remember, if we look at my markup on this one, let's just move this off to the side for a second. We have a div class of card. Inside my card, I had my title across the top. And the thing that really mattered for this case was this paragraph down at the bottom that was called links. And inside there, we had two separate links that had go to contact me and that go to learn more about me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come onto these links and I'm going to give them a class. The reason I need to give these a class because I have another link in my paragraph. So if I were to style all my links to look like buttons, the two at the bottom would, and that would be great, but so would the one in the middle of my paragraph, and that would be a problem. So I'm going to come and I'm going to give these a class of button. So let's go class equals button. And where you put a class on something that has an attribute already, like our link does with an href, it doesn't matter. If the class comes first or the class comes second, it really doesn't matter, as long as you remember to close your quotation marks, because if not, all of this falls into the class and it causes a whole bunch of problems. The coloring of this has gone off because everybody is getting all confused about what is what. So I have my class, open and close quotation marks, and then my href, or if you want, you can also put your class over here, and I can do my button like that. So when I first do that, when I add that class, the class is not doing anything. So if we were to go and look at this, it's going to look exactly the same. There's no change yet. What we need to do now is come into my styles and actually give this some styling on it. So we can come anywhere in here. I'm going to come right after my link here, and I'm going to do dot button. And I'm going to start styling it. So the first thing I'm going to do is just give this a background, because we need our background color on there, which is that FFE600 number. And I'm going to give it a bit of padding, like 20 pixels for now, just so we can see what that's actually going to look like. And before we jump in, I've given it the background. We also will want to change the color here to be black, just so we can actually see it. And let's go take a look. And it is looking all right. We have something that resembles a button coming in right now. So that's kind of cool. But there are a few problems with it. But let's pretend I didn't put that margin top on there. So if I put that down to 0 and I come take a look again, well, man, those are getting really close. And what if on my button here, I didn't have a padding of 20, but say it was 60? Okay, we're getting a little ridiculous now, but you can see that we have a big problem. These buttons are covering the text that was before them, and that's an issue. So this is where display inline block comes in. This gives us the best of both worlds. It lets us keep our elements inline, so they're next to each other, but it also allows us to have a margin top and bottom and left and right on them, so we can prevent these problems from happening. So this padding, it wouldn't just be overlapping our content, it would be taken into account, and it's not going to overlap like that. So let's try that out. On my button, let's give that a display of inline block, just like that. Now let's go and take a look. And they're still gigantic, ridiculous buttons, but at least we can read all of our text now. So it just goes and solves that problem that we had run into, and now we can do a little bit more with them. So let's fix first off the padding on here and bring it back down to 20. And we can see that it's a lot better, and we can add a little bit of spacing on those maybe. So on here, we could say like a margin right of, I don't know, 25 pixels or something, just to give them a bit of a gap between them. Maybe that's a bit too big, but we'll just leave it like that for now. But while it's working and that inline block solves this problem, our buttons aren't looking too fantastic. So in the next video, we're going to be taking a look at how we can make our buttons look pretty good, and some tips and tricks too. It's not just about follow these set things, but just some guidelines on making sort of nice looking buttons, to making some nice looking buttons that you'll be proud of. and let's give this a... All right, it's time to style buttons, but one thing I want to make clear before we jump into this lesson is this isn't quite the same as like a form button. When you fill out a form and you push submit, all of the things I'm saying for this apply. There's a little bit of extra styling that we'll put into those because we are going to be doing those at one point. So this is for something that looks like a button. Right now we're creating links that look a lot like a button rather than actually creating like a submit button or something like that. But all of the rules and general stylings that I'm giving now apply in either case. But we're sort of making fake buttons now because they're really just links that appear to look like a button. So with that out of the way, when it comes to styling buttons, put the button class, directly on the link itself like we did in the last video. And always use padding to create the size of a button and not the width and the height. So to illustrate what I mean by both of these, let's come down and take a look. What I've done is I've taken what we were just working on, but I've made a couple changes to it. So you'll notice here I have my paragraph, but inside I have my class button on this link, and then I have my second link here. I don't know why I did that on one line like that. We could have just done it like this and seen it better. So I have my two links here with the class of button directly on the link. In the second case here, what I've done is I've put a paragraph with a class of button, and then I have my link inside of that paragraph. The last other thing that I have also done is I've come and I've changed the link color, link color to black, just so we can see it in both cases, because you're going to see this is going to cause problems. We won't be able to see them if not. So we have my two buttons here, and they look really, really similar to one another. They are both inline block elements. So because of that, even though the second set was a paragraph, that paragraph is now an inline block as well. It's not forcing new lines. So at the beginning, they both look like they're doing the same thing right now. And I do have that other link is still there. It's just the text is black. So that's why there's a period all the way out here. So we have this that's working. Now the problem that happens is, let's add some margin on these. Button margin bottom of 50 pixels, just to space them out a little bit. The problem that happens here is on this one, I can click anywhere on this button to actually make something happen. Whereas on this one, I have to click on the text itself. Whereas here, anywhere in this is a clickable area. I have seen websites in the real world who have buttons that work like this, and I think that it's broken. I think it's not working because I'm clicking and I'm trying to click on it and it's not working because I'm not clicking right on the text. But we've been trained over time that you don't have to click on the text. And what makes this worse? Well, usually you don't have a button just like this. Usually your button has a hover state on it, right? So when you hover on the button, it changes just like a link would. I want you to go and set that up now. So come in here. We have my button. I want you to make a button and just change the background color of the button when somebody hovers on top of it. If you got that to work, we want our button just like this. And just like we did with links before, we can do this on a class where I can add hover on my class itself. So now when I hover on top of a button, and you can even do this for paragraphs and other things, you can literally create a hover on anything you want, but keep it exclusively for interactive things because that's what people are trained to expect. So my button is interactive. I'm going to change the background of this to something different. Let's just put orange so we have something to work with. And let's go take a look at what happens here. So when I go on top, it's orange and it looks like I can click on it. And then I click on it and I go to the contact page. Fantastic. But then I come to this one, it's changing. It looks like I can click, but if I try it, this isn't the link. The link is only the text inside. Now I'm a web developer, so I know this type of mistake happens. So it's really rare, but when I have seen this on actual websites, I think, oh, I probably have to click on the text itself and then it works fine. And I just sort of roll my eyes and wish that people had hired someone who knew what they were doing when they made their website. But this is just really, really bad user experience. So it's really important. We never, ever, ever do something like this. Or I've even seen it instead of paragraphs. I've seen it with a div like that. And I've seen it with all sorts of things. So really, really important. If you're making buttons, you're adding a class on the link itself. Or if it's a button, like in a form that we're going to be looking at in the next module, when we do that, we want the class on the button itself and not on something on the outside because we want to make sure it's on the element that we're interacting directly with. The other thing I mentioned is that we want to use padding to create the size. And I see lots of tutorials still these days that say to use a width and a height. You could use a width and a height, but let's look at why we don't want to do that. All right, so let's go here. We know we don't want to do this. This is bad practice. So let's get rid of all of that and stick with only the good stuff. But let's come and change a few things on my button here now because I have my button. So let's delete this padding and let's give this a width instead. I'm going to give it a width of, how big do you need? I don't know. Geez, how big do I need? So I'm going to say 175 pixels because it seems like a good number to me. And then I'm going to give this a height of, I don't know, what do I need to put in the height? Let's say 50 pixels. Let's go and look at what it looks like. And oh, well, look at that. We have some problems already. My text isn't centered. My text is on the side and it's not centered vertically this way. So that means I could do it. And I'm not going to get into doing it now, but I could do it. We can do a text align center, the top and bottom. Maybe you do that with your margins. And then maybe you say, okay, I have to center it vertically. So I'm going to use padding instead for that. The other problem that you run into though is now this button. So let's go and do it because it's going to demonstrate a little bit better. So I'm going to take the height off and put padding there. So we'll do padding of, say, 15 pixels top and bottom, 0 left and right. And let's do a text align of center. And now, do you see a problem? Because my buttons have a set width on them, if one of them has a short amount of text and one of them has a long amount of text, they don't look like they're the same thing. They look really off and it's really awkward and there's a problem with it right now. So don't use set widths. I guarantee you'll see it. You might go, well, all of my buttons are one word inside of them and they're roughly short. They're always short words, so it's fine. Yeah, you're probably right, and it's probably working right now, but websites are always updated in the future, and all of a sudden you have this one button in this one situation that you never thought of that is a lot longer, and it's breaking it, and it's even, maybe it's so long that it's sticking out the side of your button, and it's causing problems. And then you have to go back through your code and fix it, and then maybe that causes more problems because you never thought that was going to happen, and don't do that. So for your buttons, just use padding. And speaking of padding, the padding left and right needs to be a bigger number than the padding on the top and the bottom to make the button look balanced. So in general, I use a ratio of 1 to 2, 1 to 2.5. So the top and bottom is around 1, the sides are about 2.5. But it really depends on the button and the look that you're after yourself. So don't lock yourself into this. This is sort of like a general rule of thumb that I follow. So say I did a padding top and bottom of 15. On the sides here, I might do 45 pixels. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go look at it. And I go, actually, that looks pretty good. It looks pretty balanced. Maybe they're a little bit too long. So the 2.5 in this case doesn't work. Let's shrink that down 30. So now it's 15. So it's now like 1 to 2 ratio. So the sides are double what the top and bottom are. And I'll go and take another look. And I'm pretty happy with that. I think that looks pretty balanced. I think it looks like a nice button. To get this nice balanced look, though, you're always going to have more on the left and the right than on the top and the bottom every single time. If not, it looks a little chunky, it looks a little weird, and it can be hard to figure out what exactly is wrong with it. So it's a nice little tip for styling your buttons. And the last thing is look online for inspiration for styling your own buttons. That ratio that I came up with, I sort of fall into doing that all the time now, but I remember at one point I had like set width. I just had this set like 20 pixel padding all the way around, and I didn't like my button. It was ugly and I couldn't figure out why. And I went digging and looking at other people's buttons, and then I even ended up trying to copy other people's buttons, and I eventually realized, hey, they're all doing this. And by looking at other people's buttons, I started getting much better at styling my own. In general, when you want to learn how to make something look better, look at what other people have done and steal their ideas. If they've made something look good, they've already done the hard work to figure out how to do it. You can get inspired by that and take a bit of a shortcut. The last thing, I don't have a slide for this, but I've been looking at this and it's been driving me nuts, is the underline that's on there. So we have this underline that is running through those. And in general, on a button, you don't really need the underline to say that it's a link because we have so much on here already. So we don't want an underline. So the last thing I'm going to do is a new property we haven't looked at for our fonts yet, just like we looked at font weight. This time it's a bit weird because it's not with font. It's actually, I'm going to bring it down here because we have a text align, and it's called text decoration. And you have lots of options. We're going to explore them a little bit later. But for now, we can just do a text decoration of none. And if we go and take a look, it took that underline off. And it now looks like a nice finished button that we can be very happy and very proud of. All right, in this video, we're changing course a little bit, and we're going to be looking at something called specificity. I might have sounded a little weird saying it because it's a word I have a lot of trouble saying. So we're going to just pretend it's specificity, or if I say specificity like that, it's actually specificity. But I don't know what it is about my tongue. It doesn't like the word. I'm going to try my best to say it properly, but if I say it wrong, I'm just going to own it and pretend that everything is fine, and that's what the actual word is. So just as a bit of a word of warning there, it's really, really, my brain just can't say it properly. I don't know what the deal is. So what is it? It is all about how specific our selectors are. The more specific they are, the higher priority they have. So from the selectors we've seen so far, from lowest to highest in terms of specificity, there you go. Elements, we have the element selector, the class selector, and the ID selector. So the element is a very general selector. It selects all of that type of element. A class you can have multiple of, so it's considered more specific. And then the ID selector is the most specific of them all. So they have a priority when we're looking at those. So if we come and take a look at this layout that we've been doing, already you can see there is a difference here because this link is yellow and my buttons have a black text color on them. So why is that? So right here is a element selector. We've selected my A element. So by selecting the element, it's the lowest level of specificity that we can have. Whereas my buttons that have the color here, these are a class selector. So no matter what happens in our CSS, our class selector will always overwrite the element selector. So to give another example of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come all the way down here and put a paragraph selector, and I'm going to say the color of my paragraphs needs to be pink. So if we go and take a look, my paragraph has switched over to that pink color. And I'm going to come and create a new class. So we're just going to call this test. And I'm going to give this one a color light blue. And what we're going to do is I'm going to come into my markup. I'm going to find that paragraph and I'm going to give it a class of test. And let's go take a look at what happened. You can see that it has switched over to that light blue color. So what's happening is because this is more specific than my paragraph here, that is winning. And we also have an ID. So I mentioned that IDs, so we haven't been using a lot of IDs, but we can do it with the hash just in case you forgot. So we can do a hashtag of test. It'd be the same name. That's fine. And I'm going to give this one a color of, let's give it a color of something we haven't looked at yet. I'm going to give it the color of fuchsia because fuchsia really stands out and we're really going to be able to see it. And we'll come back over into my markup here. And we're going to keep this class on it, but I'm also going to give it the ID of test as well. And if we go and take a look now, we can see that now we have all this fuchsia text, which our text has changed over to fuchsia. And just in case you're saying it, maybe it's the order that things are showing up in here. If I move that over to here, it is still going to be fuchsia. If we come and go in my markup or my styles here, you can see the order of things is completely out of order here. So it's not based on order. It's the only thing that is making sure that my paragraph right now is the color. It's because of the specificity of my selector here. The ID selector is considered to be the highest out of all of these. So no matter what, they is going to win. And this is what's going to keep the color of it. So this is one of the reasons that many class naming conventions, when you start getting more into CSS, you're going to see that different companies have naming conventions. There's just conventions out there in general. Most of them only use classes and nothing else. Now, if you understand how it all works, you can get away with other ways of approaching things. You can use IDs and classes and element selectors and get away with it. And we're going to be looking at other things like compound selectors, and you can get away with all of this stuff. But sometimes it just complicates matters in the long run for nothing because you start getting into these battles of which one is more specific than the other, and it can cause problems. So here's how I generally approach things when I'm doing my styles. My general rules get put on the element selectors. Headings like H1, H2, H3, my paragraphs, all that type stuff, my general links, all of that will get put on just my general element selectors. I want them to stay low in their specificity because I want to be able to overwrite them after anyway when I'm doing more specific styling. And just because it makes my life a lot easier because I want to select all of them anyway, and I don't want to have to give every single one of my paragraphs a class to be able to style it. Everything else, all of my divs, my headings, my sections, all of my stuff gets a class on it so I can style it. So if you want to experiment with your own ways of doing things, that's perfectly fine. And a large part of learning is experimentation. But throughout the rest of this course, you're going to see I'm going to be using a lot of classes and trying to keep things as equal in their specificity as possible. Thank you for bearing with me through this one where I kept saying specificity wrong. We have a few more lessons on it. I really am trying my best to get it right, but this might go on for a little while. If it's driving you nuts, I really do apologize. It is impossible for me to say this word properly. Now, there's one thing that's really, really important to understand about specificity, and that is when we have two selectors of equal value. When they conflict with each other, what happens? Let's just come all the way down to the bottom here. And so we were looking at this where we had the paragraph that had different valued on there. But I have a paragraph here and it's saying pink, and let's delete these. Let's get rid of that. So we just have our paragraph of pink here. And what would happen now if I had a paragraph with a color of green? Which one's going to win? Which one do you think is going to win? Let's go take a look. Well, my paragraph is green. And another one we can try is our accent color. So if I have accent color here and I say the color on this one is deep pink, and then we go and take a look, that accent color has switched over to deep pink. So whenever we have two selectors with the same level of specificity, it's always going to be the second one which wins because the browser is reading it from the top down. So it's going, let's say we get to here, it goes, okay, my accent color should be this color. Oh, my accent color should be this color. Okay, I guess this is the one we want. Same thing here, it's going to see this one first, and then it's going to see this one, so it's taking the last one, and the last one is winning, and that is the one that is going to get the color that works. You might be going, Kevin, okay, that's simple and it's easy to fix. When you have a file that has 5,000 lines of CSS in it, this all of a sudden becomes a nightmare of yours where you're trying to change something, you're sure you got it right, you're trying and you don't understand why it's not working, and then you finally realize 45 minutes later that you had another selector lower down that was the same level and you were going crazy and it wasn't working, and you're happy you found it, but you're also a little bit frustrated. So it's just really important to know sometimes you'll be coming up and you'll be saying color should be white, and it's not working and it's not working, and you're looking all over the place, and like when I'm looking around here I don't see anything about color and I don't see anything about paragraph, but then I scroll down and I get these other things that are overwriting it. So just be careful with that. So don't start fighting things. If you're trying to change a color, there might be, check for a typo first, but then look out for things like this where you might have another selector that's trying to do the same thing lower down. In this video, we're going to be looking at compound selectors, which are something that can actually affect how specific your selectors are. They are something that is a little bit controversial in CSS. Some people say you should never use them. A lot of class naming conventions involve trying to avoid them, but they're an important thing to understand because you'll definitely run into it. And they do have certain use cases where they can apply it really well. So we're going to be building out this layout. We're going to be sort of incrementally working on it and improving on it as we get through the final stages of this module of the course. What I'm going to do first is I am going to run through and do the markup of this. It's very similar. This black section here is very similar to the card we were working on. It's pretty much the same thing. But because we're adding more sections to this and it's starting to look more like an actual website, I did want to start with a blank slate, and it's going to help you a little bit later on watching me go through the markup and the styling of this when I ask you to do a lot of it on your own. In the styles, I've kept some of the basic styles we already had. I kept the H1 and paragraph having no margin on the top. And the font sizes we were using, as well as that accent color that we'd had set up in there. So with that, I'm going to come over to here and I'm going to start writing some markup for it. I'm going to be using header, I'm going to be using sections, and I'm going to be setting everything up and explaining it in as much detail as I can, but I'm not going to be opening up this as I'm going through. So if ever you feel like you need to look at the slide as I'm doing it, just hit pause or just click on the slides. You can see what I'm referring to, and then you can come back into the video. But I just think it's going to drive you crazy if I'm opening and closing the slides continually throughout the lesson. So I'm going to do the basic structure of it first. So we have that yellow big thing right at the top. I'm going to put all of that in my header. I'm going to close my header. The reason I'm choosing a header, headers can be used in a few different situations. In this case, I'm using it as sort of saying this is the header for my entire website. This is where the title goes. Later on, we're going to see that it's used for things like the logo and the navigation as well. But for now, we don't have that. So I'm just putting my header at the top like that. The next thing I'm going to come and do is I'm going to create a section and close section. And we're going to repeat the same thing here. Section, close section. So looking at the layout, just in the small version there, I have that black background section and a white background section of my website. So they're clearly two different parts. So I'm giving them each a section like this. Now sections work just like headers, which work just like divs. Like this, they're both going to look identical. So even if you went and you created a div that had this, it would be the same advice. It would be to come on here and give it a class. And I'm just going to call it section 1 for now because it's a really generic site. This isn't the best naming convention unless you're creating like a template, but it's going to get the job done for us for now. So we have our section 1 and our section 2 that's going to help us set the styles for these up separately from one another. So now I can come into each one of these and put the content that I need. So in here, I have my H1. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to put the elements that I'm using, and then afterwards I'll bring in the text really fast so you don't have to watch me copy and paste all the content in. So in the header, in that yellow box at the top, I'm going to include the H1, which will be the title for my entire page. Then I'm going to come into section 1 here, and in my section 1, it has a few different things. We have a title for that section, so open and close H2. In general, it's considered good practice if you have a section to have a title in that section. You could actually put a header in here as well, which would be unlike the header that is here. Unlike this header, which is for the entire page because it's the first thing in the body, so that's the header for my body, this would be considered the header for my section. I don't think we need it in this case though, so I'm not going to include it. But if that makes more sense to you, by all means go for it. But generally speaking, if you have a section, it's considered really good practice to have at least an H as the first thing inside of it. I'm not choosing H1 because you should only have one H1 per page that you work on. Not per website, but per page is one H1 because it should be the title or the main topic for that page. Now my H2 is the title for this section of my website. I also have a paragraph in here. So paragraph, close paragraph. And then here I'm just going to put, I'm not going to create a paragraph for the links. I'm just going to do we have an href that's not going to go anywhere. And I'm going to give this the class of btn, which is the same as writing out button. It's just a lot shorter. So close A, and we have 2 links. So we'll put my 2 links like that, which will be styled like buttons. And to make our life easier, I'm just going to copy that and paste that whole thing in here because it's the exact same structure for the second section. We're going to be looking at compound selectors, and compound selectors are perfect for things like this, where the structure of something is the same, but the colors and the styling of it changes a little bit. My button colors are different, my link colors are different, the text and the background colors are even different. So we're going to look at how we can style this up and how we can use something called compound selectors and how they can be useful. So before I actually start styling it, I'm going to explain it to you because I want you to actually go in and try and style it yourself. So to change the color of the buttons for each section, I'd do something like this, where I'd have .section1 space .btn. So what that's doing is it's selecting my button that's inside of section 1. The space here is very, very different from a space if it was in a class name. So if you include it there, it does something different that we're going to explore a little bit later on. But in this case, what it would do, and CSS is always read right to left when you have a single selector. So it's reading it from the right. So it's going, oh, I'm going to get all my buttons that are inside section 1. And I'm going to make them look like whatever's in here. I'm going to get all my buttons that are inside of section 2, and I'm going to get them to look a different way. So this styles will only apply to this button, these 2 buttons, and this styles that I put here will only apply to these 2 buttons down. So those styles will only apply there and there. Because I'm going to set the general styling for this up, but then I'm going to get you to do a few of the specific styles before we get there. Because I do want to explain a little bit when I'm doing a bigger page like this that we haven't really looked at yet, how I approach doing the CSS for it, and some of the things I want to take advantage of along the way. And with the magic of editing, you can see that all the content is in there now. So we can come over to my styles. The first thing I'm going to do is we had my H1 and my paragraph that had no margin on the top. I'm going to add in a comma and my H2 as well, because we have an H2 that we need to select to remove that spacing on. And I'm also going to come all the way to the top on my body and create a margin of 0 on here. If you remember back to a long time ago, this is something that we will do on most pages. And in this case, on this layout, we definitely want our colors to touch the side of the screen. I'm going to do this as a page and not just like a single component on the page. So I want things to stretch from one side to the other, and I don't want any white little bar between them. So a lot of the time on our documents, we're going to be setting this margin of 0. I didn't actually use the accent color in here, so I'm going to delete that. This is sort of this general starting point. Then I'm going to do all my typography. Now I'm going to get into a little bit of layout stuff. So the first thing is my header. So my header, I can come on and say that it should have some padding on there. So we're going to do padding of like 50 pixels. And let's give that the background that is our yellow color. And the color, which is our black, which is 000, or the color black. So we can see it is working. The font sizes are a bit off. We're going to come back and fix some of the font sizes and other things up in a little bit, not in this video. I really want to focus on the compound selectors for now. So there's my header. The next thing I'm going to do is come on and I'm going to do a section selector. And I'm going to set up my padding. So let's do padding of 50 pixels again. And right away I go, whoops, I'm repeating the same thing here and here, which means just like I did with this, I should probably do the same thing. If you find you're repeating yourself, it's usually a good idea to come and create one selector that's controlling both of them. So I can do that. I can write header, comma, section. So I'm selecting both of them with a single selector. And I can bring my padding up to here, and it's going to apply to both of them. That way I can just get away with writing less lines of CSS. When you find yourself going back, you might be rolling your eyes going, oh, it was faster when I originally wrote it just by having the same thing twice. But now if ever you need to change it, it makes your life a lot easier, and you'll be changing your CSS more often than you might think. So with that, I think it's everything I really need right now. I don't want to give my sections much actual styles. The only thing they had really similar was the spacing that was going on them, and there wasn't very much else that I need to do. And you can see even in here, there's not a lot I need to do now. It's more or less where I need it to be. So I don't need this section selector anymore. I've got everything I need. Now I do need to style my section 1 though. So I can do my section 1. And I'm going to give this the background, which is black. And I'm going to give this the color, which is white. And if we come and look, we can see that it has worked. What I'm not doing is saying section 1 background is black. And then we could use a compound selector here. So I could say that my section 1 H2 has a color that is white. If we come and look, that's worked. It has switched this over, but it hasn't switched anything else over. So I'd have to do it also for my paragraphs. And I'm getting more specific than I have to for nothing. The same way I said, I want to try and put as much of the styling on the body as possible. And in this case, we don't have much, but we're going to see this is going to start getting more and more styles on it when we get into more complicated sites. The same thing applies here. If I can put a style directly on my section 1, I'm going to do it just on my section 1. I'm not going to worry about a compound selector. So we're going to keep that color of white on the section itself so I can write less code in the long run. Now, where I do need to start getting a bit more specific is with my links. And whoops, I forgot to put them in. So there we go. We have some links now. Now this link is looking good, but this link is the wrong color. So there's different ways we can approach it, but we could use a compound selector to fix that. So I want you to try and do that right now. You saw me do it with my H1 that I got rid of, but we need to change the color of the link in section 2 to be black. So I want you to try and do that, and it's going to change these down at the bottom as well. That's perfectly fine. But we want to keep these ones being yellow, and we want these ones down here to change over to black. So I'm going to let you try and do that right now on your own. So hopefully you got it to work. I'm going to do it now with a section 2 space, and I'm going to put my A selector like that. And I can say that the color of those is black. So if I go and take a look now, I can see that it has changed the color only of the links in section 2, and it has not changed the color of my links in section 1. So that's perfect. My compound selector is working the way it's supposed to. So with that knowledge, what I want you to do is go ahead and style the buttons. We've already looked at how we can create a button. Don't forget we need display inline block on them. I want you to try and set them up. Remember, the class name this time is just BTN. So with everything you know so far, see if you can get those buttons looking pretty good, and don't forget to put a hover color on them as well. All right, so I hope you got it working. I hope they're looking nice and good with their good hover colors on them and everything. What I'm going to do is I'm going to style it, and I'm going to give you a little bit. If I am using nesting, I would come up to here and I do my section 1 and then space and then dot btn. So if you did have any trouble, it could be you forgot the dot on the second one. When we're nesting, when we're doing compound selectors like this, even though we have the space, we still need to include the dot. Here we don't, because this is the element selector. So my A's that are inside of my class of section 2, where here I want my class of button, which is inside of my section 1. So I can have my section 1 button, and let's do display inline block, so we can give it the margin and padding on there, and more importantly, the padding. So let's give it that padding now. I'm going to go with 10 pixels on the top and bottom and 25 on the right and left. And I'm going to give it a background of our yellow color and a color of 000, or if you wrote black, that's fine. And if you remembered, we also had that text decoration that we can set to none to get rid of the underline that we had on it. So let's go and see what that actually looks like. I made them a little bit smaller this time. I guess they could be beefed up a little bit. I'm also going to add in one more thing here, which is font weight of bold, which we'd done on the original, but in this layout, my link wasn't bold, so I didn't have that on my default link, so it wasn't applying to my buttons. So there we go. I think it's looking pretty good. I know I used different padding in this one than I did in the previous one. If you set something up a little bit differently, that's perfectly fine too. I think I'm actually going to make this like 12 on the top and bottom, and we'll stick with that. Don't forget that we want to have a hover. So I would come here and section 1 space dot btn hover. And on here, I can add my background, which is going to be, let's make it white. And I'm going to give it a color. And the color I think could stay black because we're still going to be able to see that. Now you notice I'm putting the hover on the button. And what I've done with my hover here is I'm only changing the one property. And you probably recognize that when I was originally talking about it. But I'm only changing the one property I want to change. And I'm not worried about any of the other ones. So if we go and take a look now, we get my hover on there and I know it's an interactive element. So if you didn't already do it, set up your button too. You can use a lot of the similar things that we've seen here and see if you can find a good way to go and do it. So hopefully your button is looking great. So what I'm going to say is you could come here and we did all section 1 button hover. They're all grouped with section 1. And then I would come down to here and I would do my section 2 down here. So section 2. This one is going to change to the, it's already black. So we're going to make this one my FF. We're going to make it yellow when we hover. And my color itself can change over to black because the color of it is white. So what I'm doing is all my section 1 styling first, and then I'm coming down and doing all my section 2 styling after. I just find it easier to stay organized that way. If you'd rather keep all your button styling together, that actually makes a lot of sense, and we're going to see something about that a little bit later on. But if I am doing compound selectors like this is generally how I like to do it. I also forgot to change this over to black and the color here to white. So let's do that. FFF is white, and we can go and take a look. And it is looking good. My hovers are working. Everything is working the way I want it to. That is how we can use compound selectors. In the next video, though, I'm going to show you a way you can probably get away without using compound selectors and make your CSS a little bit more organized. And then we have it. That is how compound selectors work and one of the possible use cases for them. So we've looked at specificity, we've looked at compound selectors. Now we want to see how compound selectors and specificity, if I could say it right, I'd write it properly in the title, how they work together and the effect that compound selectors have on it. They add to how specific a selector is. So to explain it a little bit, we have our element selector, which is sort of worth 1 point. We have class selectors that are worth 10 points. And we have an ID selector, which is worth 100 points, is sort of the basic way that it's usually explained, and it makes a lot of sense. So if we go and take a look, if we had an A selector like this, it's worth 1 point, right? It's an element selector, so it's only worth 1. Whereas if I created the class link, so that would be worth 10 points. If these were trying to style things differently, this link selector would overwrite the original A because it has a higher value. Same thing with a ID selector. If you had an ID selector, it would be the most specific, so it would win if it was competing with them, just like we already saw. Where things get more interesting is with our compound selectors. So here I have a main with a link inside of it, and it's the ID. So it would just be taking the 100 points plus 1 point to give you 101 points. If we then had our main and link, I'm guessing, you can probably figure out that in this case, it would be 110 points. My class of link is more specific than my anchor selector, so that one is winning. Things can get a lot more complicated though. If I had my link class inside of an intro class, inside of a main class, then it would be worth 120 points. So even though this one has 4 different compoundingness going on, we have 4 selectors, whereas this one only has 3. The second one here has a higher value because it has 2 classes. So these 2 classes would overwrite what's happening in the first one. And you can get really, really complicated. So you might see something like this. I hope you never do. I hope you never see something like this, especially the div part. So this is an exaggeration, but it is important to understand anyway. So, how many points would that be? You just have to count them all up, and they're all worth 1 point, right? And they'd all be worth 1 point. So it's not that complicated. We get up to, we can count them all up. I think there's 12 in there, so I guess it's worth 12 points. But it's not always so obvious. So here we have 2 selectors. We have the giant crazy compound selector, and I have my class of link selector. I mentioned that we have 12 in that first one, so that would be worth 12 points. So you'd think that one would win. That would be the higher value selector. But the truth of the matter is, it's not. It's not actually worth 1 point. It's that you have your ones, your tens, and your hundreds. But when you get up to past 9 ones, you just have 10 ones and 11 ones and 12 ones. We're not getting more or higher value select. We're not jumping into the 10s and the 11s and the 12s. So this isn't worth 12 points and 10 points. This is worth 12 ones, and this is worth 110, and 110 is, it's weird, I guess, the way I'm saying it right now. But you can see that the single link would overwrite what's going on in that giant, crazy, insane compound selector that I hope you never see. So how can we actually prevent having to worry about something like this? Like, how do we, you might have been looking at this going, like, even when, let's go back a little bit to some of these ones, and like, they're not crazy complicated compound selectors. You can understand them, you can figure them out. But having to do math and, having to actually figure it out and see why something's overwriting another style that you didn't think it would be, how can we prevent having to worry about it? Give everything a single class and try and avoid compound selectors. And you're going to see when we get into more complicated things, I do have a few times where I use compound selectors, but for the most part, I avoid them like the plague because it turns into these battles and you want to avoid them and you want to keep your CSS as simple as possible. Can you figure it out? Yes, 100% you can figure it out. And you can do a little bit of counting and it's not that hard. But it's cognitive load for nothing. It's making you think when you shouldn't have to think. It should just be nice and easy and something you're not even worrying about. One way you can fix that, if we're looking at this layout that we've already been working on, where we have these 2 different sections that have our buttons in there, one way we could fix that is if we came into here and instead of having button like this and having all these buttons and requiring compound selectors, I could say that this is a button yellow and do the same thing on that one. And then on this one would be a button black, and then a button black like that. So I have my 2 different styles. They're completely different from one another. So instead of having to worry about organizing things and trying to do these buttons inside as compound selectors, I could much more easily say that this is a button yellow, my button yellow hover. Let's come right here. And then we can come to this button, which would become my BTN black. And that would overwrite all of this and be my button black cover. And just to keep things nice and simple, then we could come and have our button yellow, our button black. They're all together. So we could have a nice comment here at the top, button styles, and then you know where all of your buttons are and everything is organized together. Everything's starting to come together, but oh my goodness, now I don't see my link color here. What's going on? We have a compound selector battle, specificity war. I have my section 2 links, which are set to black, and then this button here, which is set to having its color on there, which is different. So we can go and fix that, because what's happening right now is this section 2A, that's worth, you remember how many points that's worth? That's worth 11 points. And 11 points is worth more than the 10 that we have on our button black here. So the color here, black, is overriding our color here of white. And this is the type of battles that you can get into when you start having things with compound selectors. This is really common, and the problem that compound selectors can cause, because you're not always going to be using them. So you use it somewhere, you don't use it somewhere else, and then you have unintended consequences. So it might seem crazy, but I said just give everything a class. So I could call this one even section 2 link. It's not the best name in the world. I probably wouldn't use this name, but just for a quick example. And then I would come down onto here and I'd actually give this link a class of section 2 link. And that way the class is giving it the color and not this general selector that's affecting things that I don't want it to affect. And if I come and take a look, now when I come and take a look, I can come and see that that black is working the way I wanted it to, and everything is working how I want it to, and I'm preventing these battles and having to count and having to figure out what is causing what and running into these unintended consequences along the way. So in that last video, we looked at how we can prevent these specificity wars where we're fighting and where it gets complicated and you have to figure out the value of compound selectors. And in this video, I'm going to show you a better way to name our CSS classes. And you might be going, Kevin, why did you even show us all that stuff if you're going to end up here just showing us the right way to do it? And it's because you need to understand how compound selectors work, because you will use them and you will run into them in the real world for sure. These are the types of problems that people are consistently running into, and I want you to understand what's causing the problems. But now that we know what's causing the problems, let's look at how we can actually name things to just make our life so much easier. So I've already talked about not repeating ourselves, trying to avoid it as much as possible. And you might have noticed that we're repeating ourselves a lot with our button styles right now, right? So if we come and look at our CSS file, there's a lot that's similar here and here. And I could come and we could do something like this, and that would work fine. But there's an even better way to do it. So we had something like this. Now we've renamed those. They're not compound selectors anymore. But we have this where we have the display inline block on the two of them. And then we have the padding on the two of them, and the font weight and the font size that are all the same. We're repeating ourselves over and over again. Now, what we could do is we could come into our CSS and we could do it like we did here, where we have our H1 or H2, our paragraphs. So we could make a comma separated selector like this and select all of the different pieces and give them the same styles. But there's an even better way of doing it. We can use 2 classes instead of 1. You don't have to only have 1 class on an element. You could have 100 classes on an element if you wanted to. So the first thing we want to do is create a generic button class. So something like this. It has all of those shared properties. So let's go and do that right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take button yellow here, and let's take all of that off, and let's take off the things that we do want to change. Oh, I forgot about text decoration in my slide. So let's take off the background and the color. We want something that every single button is going to have, and we can delete the rest of this. So now I have a generic button class, and I want to put that button class on all of my buttons in the markup. And what I'm doing now, you might hear, if ever you hear somebody say refactor your code, this is refactoring code. We're going through code that we already have and we're making it better, or we're changing how it works for a specific reason. So this could be reorganizing a CSS file. It could be changing when you get into JavaScript eventually. It could be going in on this really complicated function and getting it from 150 lines to 20 lines of code. It's going to have the same functionality, but it's going to run faster because you've made the same you've managed to figure out how to do the same thing in a more efficient way. So that's when you refactor your code, that's exactly what we're doing right now. It's something you'll 100% end up doing in the real world. So we have our generic button class now. And now what we want is a modifier class that's just going to be dealing with the colors. So we have our button, which is the generic class, and then we can add in a button accent and a button dark, or it could be my button yellow and my button black, however you want to name them. In general, some people will say, and I'm one of them, that you shouldn't put colors in, because what if you change the color scheme of your website in 6 months and your button yellow is now purple? So if you use accent and then like a dark color, because all that button will always be dark. And again, maybe that could change. Maybe button dark, it's not the best. I've seen button primary, secondary, accent, things like that also exist. So let's go and try that out. So if you want to go ahead and just set these up yourself, you can, but we don't really know how to use them yet. So, and it is a bit of repetition. I know you've done this. So if you want to run through it again, by all means, go for it. But if you don't want to, that's all good. And button dark, I said we're going to call it. My accent will be background of our yellow color, and the color of it will be black. And my dark will be a background of black with a color of white, just like that. So how can we actually put two classes on one element? Well, what we can do is in our markup include a space. So here I would have my button accent, and on this one I would have my button dark. So the first thing I'm doing is it has a class of button, then I'm putting a space and I'm saying button accent. And on this one I'm doing my generic button class and I'm putting a space and it's button dark. And it's going to add those two classes together. It's going to take both of them and apply both of them to that element. So let's go and update our code to get those working. So I'm going to get you to come into here and just add the right classes into the buttons to get it to update and be the correct one. And then I'm going to run through it and quickly do it as well. So it wasn't too complicated, right? We have our button accent that we put on these two. And we had our BTN dark that we put on these two. Now this one I'm going to purposely leave them stuck together. We can get to work. And then before I do that, I spelled accent here with 3 C's instead of 2. So that wouldn't have worked at all. So let's go and look at our page now and hit refresh. And there we go. We can see these two buttons are working it nice and fine. And when I come down, this one is working. Now, if you ever forget to do a space, none of the styles are going to apply. So this is looking like one of my generic normal links. There's no styling on it that's actually going to work because it just goes, I don't know what this class is. So if ever you go to set this up and you forget a space, just come back, put your space in, and then everything should end up working perfectly fine. Now we have my button darks working on there. And before I let you go, because I think that that's not too complicated, but there's something that's really important is in our HTML, if we put a space in our class attribute or an ID, so you could have multiple IDs on something too, we're giving it multiple classes. So I've given it the generic BTN class as well as the BTN accent. This is not the same as adding a space in CSS, which we just saw was compound selectors. So I realized that it's a little bit weird that it works differently in the two of them, but it's two completely different things. And the markup is saying we have multiple classes. The other one is saying it's classes inside of classes. It's adding to the specificity of it. It's completely different. So if you went and we tried to do something like button.btn accent, that's not going to work. This is not the same thing as it's looking for a button accent inside of a button. And we don't have a button accent inside of a button. If you ever need to select two different things, you can do it like this. Where if you remember way back to the early days when I first started talking about CSS, I said you could have paragraph button accent. It's not, say this is A. We could say any link with our button accent class on it, and that's going to work. So if ever you need to, you could have button accent, and it's saying a button with a class of button with a class of button accent together. Whereas a space here would be a button accent inside a button. But if you forget everything I just said, that's fine, because I don't want you doing that anyway. I want you just using single classes as much as possible. But if you need a compound selector, we know how to do them. And here it's adding, if I put a space, it's saying it's a class of button and a class of button accent. This is a really important concept to know for something called dry, which is don't repeat yourself. We want to write code where we're not repeating ourselves as much as possible. We can write less lines of code, and that code becomes more versatile because now I have that generic button class. If I need a third button, it's super easy to go ahead and make a third button without having to go. Imagine if If we were using that comma system here and I had button 1, button 2, button 3, here there's the generic styles, and then here I have a specific style for it. But then I add a button 5. Okay, now I have to add it here, and then I have to remember, so I create my specific styles from button 5, but then I also have to remember to come back up to here. It's a pain in the butt. So writing code like this makes your code a lot more versatile and makes it a lot easier to make things that are component based, which is a really important part behind writing CSS these days. Now, this lesson was just a snippet of a very big course that I'm currently building on how to build responsive websites. And if you're interested to know when the full course actually launches, the text that's right in front of you right now is a link. You can click on that. It'll let you sign up to get updates. I'm going to be releasing updates, sharing a few of the projects we're going to be working on, also answering any questions you might have along the way, and of course, letting you know when it launches. You'll be one of the very first people to know when it actually does launch and have all the details on it. We're going to be making several full projects, multi-page sites. It's going to be a ton of fun. So if you want updates on that and to know everything about it, and you want to be the first to know when it does launch, just click that link and sign up for the updates. So we're approaching the end of the CSS fundamentals by looking at the font properties. Fonts are something you want to play with and change a lot because nice style means usually nice typography. But I got some bad news for you. There are a lot of font properties. And honestly, it can feel sometimes like you'll never remember them all. You will. Please do not worry about it. We've already seen CSS repeats itself a lot. You're going to be using a lot of these a lot of the time. Some of them you've already seen, some of them you might be remembering more than others, and it's probably because of how much you've been using them. Font size, we've been playing with that a lot. Or the text align, I've used that and brought it up a few times. Whereas getting rid of that underline, you might not remember how to do it yet because it's text decoration and we've seen it twice. But you're going to start doing it a lot and you're going to start getting used to it. So don't worry, you're going to get used to all of these properties. The biggest problem with the property names, though, is they almost feel like a practical joke. I often get students going like, well, why is it named that? And I just go, I don't know. So what I mean is, well, we have our font properties. By font properties is all the ones that start with font. So we have font family, font size, font weight, font style. That family is what font are we using? I'm sure in Word, you've gone and changed the font away from Times New Roman to something else. So the font family, that's how we change or control the font that is being used. The size, well, we've already seen font size. We've briefly seen font weight, which is bold, light, things like that. And then there's the font style. That's if you want to make your text italic without using an M tag. There's other ones that start with text. We've seen that. We've seen text align and text decoration. There's also text transform, which is to make all cap text and things like that. So you have this category of font properties, you have a category of text properties, and then there's a few outliers like color. Honestly, color being just color and not like font color drives me insane, because the amount of times I've put a background color on my color and then not been able to figure out why the background wasn't changing. I still do that now, and I've been writing CSS for 20 years. And I'm not embarrassed to say it because these are the types of mistakes everybody makes. We all make silly mistakes. We all have our own that we make and we sort of get stuck with, and that's one that I keep making that is ridiculous. But it's just color by itself. Why they made it just color, whereas everything else starts with something, I don't really know. And then we also have line height. If you know about typography, you know about leading, that's what line height is. One thing I do have is a cheat sheet that you can download. If you click the link here right now, it will bring you to a page where you can download this cheat sheet. It's a PDF if you want it. It's not all the font properties. There's a lot. There's a crazy amount of font properties, but these are the ones you're going to need to get started and to rely on a lot. In here, I give the property name, the different types of values that you can give to it, and a brief description of what it's for. Some of the descriptions are much shorter than other ones. So if you want to download that cheat sheet, it's yours for free. You can go ahead and get it. In the next video, we're going to start playing around with a few of them, starting with the font family. In this video, we're going to be looking at font families and what a font stack is and how you can create font stacks. First, though, we're going to look at font families because that's the property that we're using to set the font that you want to use on any given selector. So something like font family Helvetica, and you can do Times New Roman, Arial, any font you want. We can also use generic font styles, though, which use our computer's defaults. So if you don't know what font you want necessarily, so if you don't know if you want Helvetica or Arial, you're not a font person, you could technically just write sans serif. Or if you wanted a serif font, you write serif. For cursive, the cursive one might be a little weird, but you can use any of those fonts you want for your font family. So why don't we give this a try on the site that we've been working on up until now. So in here on the CSS, let's go all the way up to the top, come onto your body, and come and give it a font family. You can try giving it cursive, try giving it serif, sans serif, and see what they look like. And if you want to try setting specific fonts that you have, you can try setting those specific fonts as well. So hopefully that worked well. If you ran into any problems when you're trying to use specific fonts of your own, hopefully the rest of this presentation will help clear up some of the things that might have gone wrong along the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here and I'm going to set the font family to serif, and let's go take a look at how that affected everything. And you can see the fonts have completely changed to a serif font. Now maybe you already had serif fonts there. It's always possible because we don't know what the default is for the person. So if you already saw them this way, let's just come and switch it over to sans serif. And now we can see that all of them have switched over to that sans serif. And just for fun, let's set it to cursive, because why not? And we can see that in this case, the cursive is Comic Sans, which is an interesting default. Don't use Comic Sans. A couple of others that you can also use. There's Monospace, which is like the font that we actually have in our code editor here in Scrimba, where it will look more like one of those old computer style ones where every letter is the same width. And interestingly enough, there is a fantasy style. Will be probably different depending on your computer. In my case, I'm not a huge fan of that. It's hard to read. So I'm actually going to go and set this to Helvetica while I'm here, just to have something. Now, when you're setting a single font like that, there is a problem. And that problem is when setting a font family, that font will only work if the visitor of your site has that specific font installed on their computer. So you might set it to a font you have on your computer. You got it from the font. It looks really cool. I come and visit your site. I don't have that font. I'm not going to see it. The other thing is we do have those generic ones. We have sans serif, serif, or cursive, fantasy. We don't know what font's actually coming in there. So you might put cursive. You're seeing one thing on your computer, but then I'm getting there and I'm seeing Comic Sans. So we don't have the control over it when we're using one or the other. Enter the font stack, which helps solve this problem. When we use font stacks, we're pretty much declaring backup fonts to use if the first one we wanted didn't work. So here's a really basic example. You have your selector here, and then on your font family, and you'll list out a whole bunch of different fonts. So Helvetica New, if the visitor doesn't have Helvetica New, we'll go over to regular Helvetica. If they don't have Helvetica, we'll go to Arial, and now we've covered like all our Mac and Windows users. And if there's somebody on some weird system somewhere, worst case scenario, we end up at the sans serif over here. This can take quite a bit of work to set up, and some people really get into detail on their font stacks, and they want to make sure things are, like the size of the letters and everything's going to match as closely as possible. We're not going to be diving that deep into it, but I do want to make sure you understand how a font stack works and the importance of having a font stack. So again, if Helvetica New doesn't work, it's going to go to this as like the backup. If that one isn't loading in because the person doesn't have that one on their computer, we'll go to Arial, and then we'll eventually get to a sans serif. It can be hard if you're trying to do this on your own, if you're trying to figure out all the different fonts, but it doesn't have to be. There's lots of resources for them, including cssfontstack.com. So you can actually click on this right now and it'll open it up in a new tab, and you can dive in there and look what they have. They list out a whole bunch of fonts that you might want to use on your site. So I'm going to go and look. Now, it is a bit of an old site, so the layout doesn't look super up to date. And also, there's a little copy icon, but it uses Flash to try and do it. So it's very possible that you'll try and do it and it won't actually copy anything. So I want Garamond. I'm going to click on it. And there's a whole bunch of information there. There's the amount of Windows and Mac computers that have it installed. There's a whole bunch of stuff on different sizes and weights and line heights and stuff. But where it has preview your fonts, there's a whole bunch of stuff. And there's a CSS font stack down near the bottom. So I'm going to grab that font stack there, and I'm going to paste it in right here. I want Garamond. That's the font that I want people to see. If they don't have Garamond on their computer, it's going to try for Baskerville, and then it's going to work its way down through a whole bunch of other fonts and eventually end up on the serif. But chances are it's probably hit on one of these. And the idea with it is, Baskerville's not Garamond, but it's really similar. And then Baskerville Oldface, it's a little bit different, but it's obviously super similar. Hoffler text, we're not quite as close, but hey, it's not too bad. Times New Roman, it could be better, but hey, if worst case scenario, and okay, you have no fonts installed on your computer, let's just go to our default serif over here. So at this stage, what I'd encourage you to do is try setting fonts on a few different properties in here. Try doing it. If we can come and look. I've switched it over for my whole site, but why don't you come and try putting a different one on our button that we've created? On our heading, on our paragraph, coming through and change up them using CSS Font Stack, or if you want to look up for other font stacks that you can find online. play around with it, get used to setting a few font families. And then once you're feeling pretty good with it, in the next video, we're going to explore another option, which is going to give you a little bit more freedom in the choices of fonts you're using. You might not want to use those fonts that are coming from the font stack site or just fonts that are on the computer. You might want a bit more choice. Google Fonts does that. Not only does it allow us to pick different fonts than what you might have on your computer or when they're in that font stack, but it allows us to pick creative, fun fonts and be pretty sure that everyone will get the same experience because they're all going to be getting the same fonts. Google hosts the fonts online and we can link to them. So as long as their servers are up and everything's going, and it's Google, so most of the time everything is going to be okay, we know that everyone is going to be getting those fonts. So the way to do it is you just go to fonts.google.com. You can click on that link in the slide now. It should bring you there, and it will give you a site that looks a little bit like this. There are different ways to sort through and find different fonts. You can sort by trending. You can sort by different categories, by different properties the fonts have, if they're fat, if they're narrow, if they're, a whole bunch of different stuff. And there's lots of fonts up on there. So you have a lot of choice of fonts as well. To choose a font, what you want to do is click the plus sign on any of the fonts that you see there. And you can actually choose like 7 fonts if you want to. Not going to encourage that. We'll talk about why in a little bit. But you can choose different fonts that you want. Now, one thing that I would look for are fonts that have lots of styles. So I realize it's a little bit small, but this Roboto here has 12 styles on it, 8 styles, but then this one only has 1 style. Different styles means things like italic, bold, light, extra bold, black. By choosing fonts that have more styles, you do have more options in what you're going to be doing. Now, when you click the little plus sign, it's going to add this black bar down here at the bottom, and it's going to say how many font families you currently have selected. So right now I've only selected one. I took Montserrat, which is the font that I used, though we've been coding up lately with the yellow and black. And I'm going to give you a chance to go try it. Don't get it yet, because there's a few steps that we need to get through, but you don't have to use the same font that I used. You can go crazy and find some fun stuff that are in the Google Fonts. So when you have this black bar down at the bottom, choose all the different fonts you do want to be using, and then you click on the black bar. When you click on it, it pops up. And what it does is it's going to give you 2 bits of code. The first one is a link code here. So it's literally just a style sheet link. You copy and paste it in the head of your document. And then there's this bit of CSS, which is just giving you the font family and the font stack, which Google font stacks are always very basic. It's always the name of the font followed by sans serif or serif or whatever the style of font it is. So now I want you to try it out. So I'm going to let you go to the Google Font site, explore, have fun over there, and then find that the link to the font once you've chosen it that we just looked at in that slide. And once you have that and you're ready to go, you can come back to here, hit play, and I'm going to look at how we can set it all up to actually use the font. So if you had some fun on Google Fonts, it's a fun place. There's lots of stuff to explore over there. So I'm going to come over here to my index and I'm going to link to the Google Font. So what I've done is I've literally just copied the line of code. I've double clicked in there, hit Command C, come over into here, and I'm going to paste it right in. Now what I'm doing is I'm linking this before my style sheet, because I want to make sure that when I get to the style sheet that this is already loaded in and it's already available so I can use those fonts. So I've linked over to Google. Now I'm coming, and then I have my own style sheet here. So I end up with 2 style sheets. One is for Google Fonts and one is the other one. There is another way you can bring your fonts in with an import that you put in your style sheet, but it tends to be slower and not as good on performance. So I'm going to encourage you to stick with it and do it this way. Now, once you have that, you might have the same font as me, or you might have something different. So this could look a little bit different, but it should more or less be the same. Then we can come and steal that little mini font stack they gave us, go over to our CSS and put it in right there. And once we've done that, we should be able to come over and see those fonts working on our site. And I can see it looks a lot like that original design that I had because I'm actually getting the right fonts that are in there. But there is a big problem, and you might be noticing that my bold text is no longer bold. Oh my goodness, what's going on? That's really weird, right? It is. It's super strange. But there's a really specific reason for it. So what happens is we need to also tell Google Font what weights and styles we want to be using, or our bold and italics might not work. They might not work because they're not loading in those versions of the font. So when you get this big black bar that pops up where we got our embed code from, there's a little customize option over there. And what we need to do is we need to click on that customize option, and then we need to choose all the different ones we want to be using. So in this design, I use the regular and I use the extra bold, and that was it. And once we've done that, you go back over to your embed. So you click on embed again, and you come over and take this code again. Because what's actually happened is they've changed it. It's not only giving me the name of the font here, but you can see it's giving the 400 and 800. If we go back here, you can see there's numbers next to all of these. Regular was 400, extra bold was 800. So it's loading in those two into that style sheet. So now after you've done your customize, it updates this link. So if you've added italics, it's going to add the italics in there as well. Whatever you've put, it's going to add here. So once you've done that, come back to your embed, copy this again and paste it in. So go and try it out. If you close the tab or if you never did, you can go and try it now by clicking that link. And then I'm going to do it in my own code as well. All right, so I've gone and I got the updated link here. So I'm going to come through and put that link in, and you can see now I have 400 and 800. I'm going to undo that change, and you can see here it's just the font name, and there's nothing about the different weights that I want. Whereas now it's specifying that I want these two. If you don't specify, it's always just going to be the regular and it's not going to load in anything else. So now if I come back to my layout, my bold fonts are working again because now I'm loading in a bold version of that font and everything is nice and dandy. And the interesting thing with this is if ever you want to change a font weight, you have to just use the numbers that you see here. So if I wanted to set a specific style, say on my links here, I could say that the font weight is actually 800. And that's why in the Scrimba editor, you might have noticed when you do font weight, you get a big drop down of a whole bunch of stuff that included things like bold, but you'll also see a whole list of numbers from 1 to 900. So that's the reason, is because fonts are often done, the font weights are often done with a number rather than saying bold or light or something like that. So setting the font weight to 800 on my links, if I go and look, now I get that big black font on my link as well. So play around with it, set up some different fonts if you want to experiment, put different fonts on your heading, on your paragraphs, do whatever you want, have some fun with it, experiment with it, the different fonts that are available to you. Make sure you know what's going on. And then I do have one really important thing to talk about once you're done that, but I want to let you experiment first before I start talking about the bad stuff. Okay, so hopefully you found some fun fonts, you enjoyed your time searching around on Google Fonts. Now the bad stuff. The fonts have to be downloaded to the person's computer. And that can be slow and it can cause fonts to sort of shift. And we call it a FOUT, which is flash of unstyled text. Because what's going to happen is the sans serif version is going to come in while the font is downloading. And then once the font is finished downloading, then it's going to go to the actual font that you wanted. And the problem that can happen is if you choose a whole bunch of styles, if some fonts have so many styles, you have like a thin and a light and an extra light and a bold and a regular and a semi-bold and a black and an extra black. Every one of those has to be is an extra weight. It's doubling up pretty much the size of the file that has to be downloaded, and it really, really slows things down. And that's why you want to make sure you're only checking off the ones that you're actually using. And if you choose 4 fonts, each one with a regular and a bold, that's like getting 8 different fonts that it has to download. So you want to be really, really careful because fonts are often one of the things that slow sites down the most. And we want to try and make sites as quick as possible. And as I said, all of us, I'm sure you've been on a page on your phone, I guarantee it, where you're scrolling through and then, the page loads, you start scrolling and then everything jumps around. Part of it is ads loading, and part of it is often the font changes. And when the font changes, the whole layout sort of shifts around a little bit. So just to be careful with that and try not to go too crazy with the Google Fonts. And also, before you go, there are other options. There's things like FontKit. You can check out Font Squirrel. There are ways of using, if you have your own fonts, that as long as they're a compatible format for web, which is different from fonts that we use on our desktop computer, there are ways that we can have the user use those as well instead of using Google Fonts. We're going to look at those much later on. For now, I think it's nice to keep it nice and simple, and Google Fonts are super easy to use, so we're going to stick with those for the time being. And they do have the advantage that the popular fonts, a lot of people have already downloaded them because they've already been to other sites that have used that Google font. So it's in their system, it's in their cache, and they don't have to download it again then. So Google Fonts do have the advantage of being a little bit faster often than some of the other sources, but there's other sort of tricks and things behind it. Online typography is a complicated matter a little bit when it comes to choosing fonts and all the different things we can do with it. Inheritance is a really important concept in CSS, and it almost exclusively applies to text. And I put by default there because it's by default, you can make anything inherit. There's a way of making just whatever you want inherit, and it can be useful to do that sometimes, but the default is that most text properties are inherited. So inheritance is the idea of how certain properties are inherited from their parents. So this is literally just like how we inherit things like our eye, hair, or skin color from our parents. So, both of my kids have blue eyes and their mom has blue eyes. So, they got it from their mother. They inherited that from their mother. The thing is, in CSS, it's much more predictable. If you have two people that are going to have a kid, and, like maybe I have green eyes and my wife has blue eyes, one of my kids could end up with brown eyes because a bunch of their grandparents have brown eyes. And then, like, so it's complicated when you're talking about how a person looks and where their hair and skin and all those colors come from. With CSS, you know exactly. There's no ifs and or buts. It's not from this or maybe this other thing. It's really, really straightforward. As I said at the very beginning, most type related properties are inherited. So this literally makes our lives so much easier because we can write a lot less CSS. So just like we saw, I set my font family on the body and it flows through the entire document. That's fantastic. That's great. It makes my life so much easier. We can also set the color for each section and it will apply to everything inside of that section. And obviously I overwrote it for my links here, but if you remember when I did section 1, I put the background color and the text color on section 1 and not on the H1 and on the paragraph that were inside of it. We looked at how we could use a compound selector, but we didn't have to use a compound selector, so we didn't bother. So this is a really great and cool thing. But there are some times where things are a little bit weird, such as our links that aren't inheriting certain properties. And you might be wondering because they are text, so why don't they? Same with our headings. There's something a bit interesting with those as well. So we're going to explore those in the next video, and then we're going to play with the code just a little bit more. All right, so sometimes we want to overwrite things that are inherited, and other times there's things that aren't being inherited that we do want to actually be inherited. So what happens when you overwrite an inherited property? What do you think might happen? So say I have my body is color light blue, my section 1 has a color of orange, and my paragraph has a color of pink. The color is something that's inherited, so my paragraphs should be inheriting this light blue color. But what's going to happen if I overwrite it? Can you take a guess? And if you said that your paragraphs will become pink, you're right. So this is the idea that we're being more specific. So this is going to win out and it's going to overwrite the inheritance. So we can see this in action here where I've set that up. So you can see here that all my paragraphs have become pink. I have the orange that is coming into here, but even this paragraph isn't orange. And that's really interesting that this one here is in orange because you would think maybe this is a more specific selector. I have a class selector here and an element selector here. The reason that it's still becoming pink and it's not sticking with the orange is because that class selector is not selecting my paragraph. It's selecting this whole section, and that section means everything inside it is going to try and inherit that orange color. So everything's trying to, but then it gets to my paragraph, and my paragraph goes, nope, you're not inheriting anymore. Instead of inheriting, you're getting a pink color. So if I were to turn off that pink, let's just turn it into a comment. Now that's going to be orange, and this one's going to be light blue because my body has light blue, and here I have section 1 is set to orange. So what's the deal with links not changing color? Why don't links inherit a color just like all our other text does? Inline elements just like M and strong, and let's come into my code here and turn off this link color. So we get rid of the yellow link color, and we're going to come and look here, and we can see it's turned to blue. But if I have strong text or if I have an M to make italic text, those are going to keep the paragraph color. This is an inline element. Why is it blue? Why isn't it inheriting this orange that I set it to? My paragraphs were black and they're inheriting orange. Why don't my blue links inherit the orange color as well? Well, they already have a default style on them. That default style is setting their color to blue, and it has the text decoration on it giving them that underline. They do inherit other properties though, like font size and font weight. So just to show you what I mean by that, if we come into here, we have a font size of 18 pixels on there already. If I change this up to 30 pixels and we go and take a look, my links got bigger. So they are inheriting properties. They're just not inheriting the color property because the browser people, they want to make sure links look like links. They want to do everything they can to make that stand out. So the color and the text decoration, they're on there by default, and you have to explicitly overwrite those if you want to change them, just like we did here when we did RA. So I can change the color if I want, but it's not an inherited property. Another one that's actually kind of interesting, you may or may not have noticed, is headings don't inherit the font weight because they're bold by default. They have some default styling on there already, but once again, you can overwrite it. So there's nowhere in this document anywhere that I've said that my H1 should be bold. But if we come and look at it, it is bold. It is set to bold. It's nice and big. I'm not saying anywhere that it should be. Now, could I overwrite that? I sure could. I could come in here and say that the font weight is 400 because we saw that 400 is the regular font weight from the Montserrat that I got and that I loaded in from Google. And now it's no longer bold. So I can overwrite the default. So that's the same as with my links, actually. My links have the default. So just like the text here is by default black, it's not actually default black, it's default to inherit, and it's inheriting it from the body. So what I could actually do on my links if I really wanted to is instead of giving them a color, I can actually tell them inherit. That's an option. It's a value that we can give to anything. And that means that the color will actually inherit from the parent. So that's really, really interesting and can be really, really useful depending on how you want to style things. Now, again, we want our links to really stand out. So maybe this isn't the best idea in the world, but it is an option. And you can make any property in CSS inherit. It's not something you're going to use terribly often, but every now and then it can come in handy. I'm really excited because we've made it to the end of this module. You should be really proud of yourself for making it this far, to put everything we've learned together into one thing. And there's one new thing with this that we haven't looked at yet because it flows really well into the next section of content. What I'd like you to do is try and do as much of this on your own as possible. I say that all the time, and I really want to see how far you can get on your own without seeing how I've done anything. Now, there is one thing that's a little bit different with this, as I mentioned, and I want to treat it as a bit of a challenge. So I am giving you everything you need right here in this video. When I do the code for this, I'm only going to do the HTML, and then in the next video, I'm going to do the CSS. If we just look quickly at what I've given you, I have given you the colors, I've given you the font family, all the font sizes that we need, including for the body. So don't put that on the paragraph, put it on the body so it gets these buttons as well. The 2 font weights, so we're using Lato, which is a Google font. I'll put a link to Google Fonts in the notes of the lesson. The buttons have to have a hover state and focus state, so the color of them will change. And they must have 2 classes, so the generic class and a modifier class. Now, last time we had 2 buttons that looked the same up here and 2 that were different down here. This time we've just grouped them together at the bottom. And like our buttons, our links also need a hover state and a focus state. For those, you might not be able to use these colors. You can just use your own color or anything you want for that, just to make sure, if we hover, we want to be able to read the text still. So if you switched it over to white, you won't be able to see it here. If you switch it over to black, you won't be able to see it on this one. So you can choose your own color for the links hover color. Now, the one thing I have done different is I've said that the total width should be 620 pixels, but the background must extend from one side of the browser to the other. So that means going from here all the way over to here. But this space here is going to be limited to 620 pixels. Now, if you first start doing this and you're not really sure how to do it, you know how to do everything else in here. So you remember when we did this one, we limited this to a total width in the background, didn't extend out the sides. You can do it that way if you want, instead of having it where the background is sort of limited to that 620 pixel width plus a bit of padding if you want. I will give you a bit of a hint though, and I am going to be using an extra little bit of my HTML to set the widths. So I don't know if this is going to help you or not. When you watch me do the HTML, I'll try and explain it a bit more. And when I do the CSS, it'll probably make a lot of sense. But if you do it and at the very beginning, it looks similar to this layout where the background is limited in size, that's perfectly fine. That means you're using everything we've learned up until now. I'm just throwing this extra challenge at you with this little hint that might be able to help you out. But if you're not too sure what to do with it, that's completely fine. I'd really like it if you could go through and actually do the entire thing. Even though I'm just going to do the HTML in this video, that's going to give you the chance in the next one when you have my HTML that you can just write some CSS for, to see if you can come up with the solution to the 620 if you didn't already figure it out. So what I've done here is I've given you the image like usual. We're starting with an index file with nothing in it, and I have given you the text. Go see how far you can get with this. Hopefully you're able to get through the whole thing, maybe not with that limiting width thing. See if you can figure out how to do that, but if you're really, really not sure, please don't stress about it, because we're going to look at it together and it's not that complicated, but it's a really important concept because we're going to be using it a lot from now on. It's something that's super common in pretty much every website that's out there these days. All right, so let's go, and I'm going to take a look at my HTML now. So hopefully you had a good time with it and you got through everything all right. So I'm going to start with my doc type HTML at the top, and then open HTML and close HTML just like that. Then we'll go back inside of my HTML tags, and I'm going to create my head, not header, head, and close head. And then I also want my body and close body. I'll come into my head. And for now, I'm only going to do the title. I'll create the link to my CSS file in the next video when I start writing my CSS. We did it. We did it. We made it to the end of this module. So you should be really proud of yourself for getting this far. All right, so now we can get into the body itself. Now, if we come and look, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to put the content right away. I'll fast forward that, but I'm going to do all of the structure. So here we have my H1 with a heading inside of it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this pink box, I'm going to give that its own div. I'm going to call it container, and I'm going to reuse that div in each one of these sections. So I have my header with a container and then my H1. Then I'm going to have my section 1, which is this whole white background. I'm going to give that the container and then all the content in there. And then I'm going to have my section 2. Inside my section 2, I'm going to give it a container, and then I'm going to give it all of the content that lives in there. So let's go and do that. So we have my header first, followed by a section, and followed by yet another section. There we go. And both of these sections, because we do want them to look differently, I'm going to give each one of them a class. I'm going to go with a pretty generic name for now, just because it's a pretty generic site. Once we start getting into layouts where the sections sort of have a bit more meaning to them, even though we'll still be using some filler text, it will, I think we'll be able to come up with some better section names. But section 1, section 2 is still pretty descriptive of what we're up to. So we can come into our header now. So as I mentioned, I'm going to give this a div class of container, close div. And that's that pink magenta box that I have in my layout over here. So that's what's going to have that width on it and what's going to hold the content in the middle of my page. And then in there, I can have my H1. Now I'm going to come into my section 1 and we'll do the same thing. Div class equals container. Inside that container, we have an H2. We have an image and we have a paragraph. On my image here, I'll also put my SRC and my ALT like that. So if you did this, just try not to forget the alt attribute on your images whenever you put one in a site. So inside my section 2, unlike the other sites the other layout we did, the section 1 and 2 are actually a little bit different than each other. So, but one thing that will be similar is this container to once again hold the content in the middle of my page. So I have my container. Let's do my H2. And this time we have 2 paragraphs. And then we have my 2 buttons. For my 2 buttons, I'm going to give them a class. So class is equal to, we'll close A, and we'll come back and give it the class name. So we're going to say BTN for button, or if you write it button, that's perfectly fine too. I'm going to do BTN just because it's a bit shorter. And then I'm going to call the first one button accent. And let's just speed it up by copying and pasting. And then this one can be button. I said not to use colors, but we're on a really generic layout here. I'm just going to put button white because it's a white button. It could be like button light instead of white, maybe if the color of it could get changed around, but I'm going to leave it like that. If you came up with a better name, then that's great because that's not the best one, but it'll work for now. So there is all the content in place. That is the structure of our site and everything that will be doing it. I'm going to go through now and just fast forward as I put all the content in, and then we'll preview it and make sure it's looking good before we get into the next video where I do the CSS. All right, so there is all of the content done, all of the content placed. So let's go take a look and see what that actually looks like. I'm going to just expand that out. And we can see all of the content is in place. I have my links that are in place. I've put in the bold text. I have my 2 links here at the bottom. Just a really important note on those links. So even though they are on separate lines here, because they're inline elements and there's nothing creating a new line of content, they will be one next to each other, just like they're showing up right here. So if you got stuck at any point along the way or yours doesn't look like this, you can compare in the notes in Scrimba to what I did here. Just watch out for sometimes missing quotation marks or missing closing tags on a link, because if you have a missing closing tag on a link, then you end up with a whole bunch of link everywhere. So just make sure that nothing like that was missing in any of the places, and it should help you along the way. In the next video, we're going to look at how we can style this up and make it look awesome. All right, so we have our page mostly done. Now it is time to do the CSS for it. So I don't know where you got to along the way when you were doing it yourself. So what I'm going to say is if you want to try and do the CSS on your own, but if you already did the whole thing and you just want to see if I approach it in a different way, you can do that. Or if you want to see how I approach these pink boxes because you're still not sure about that, that is awesome as well. So I'm going to come into here and I'm going to create the link to my style sheet. And I haven't made that yet, but that's all right. So we need an href on here. And if ever you make a link and you put an SRC and you're not sure if it's SRC or href, It's okay. I mix it up too. The way I tend to remember it is this is a link and my A's are links as well, even though they're a different type of link, but they're both links and they both use an href. So that's sort of how I try and remember which one it is out of the two of them. So I'm going to put my style sheet in a CSS folder and I'm going to call it styles.css. And as I've said throughout, if you called it something else, that's perfectly fine. And don't forget, we also need the rel attribute here as well to tell it that it is a style sheet. So I have a link, but it's not going anywhere yet. So let's make that. I'm going to make a new folder called CSS. And then in that folder, I'll make a new file called styles.css. And there we go. We can start writing it. So let's just see if it's working. Body, background, and I'll do purple this time so it's not as bright on the eyes. And awesome, everything is working and we can get going. So let's think a bit of how I like to approach my CSS. And I've mentioned it before, but I always start everything with the body because a lot of the things for text that we put will cascade down from the body. Such as the font size, color, the font family, anything like that. So I'm going to set as much up on the body as I can. I always try and do as many things on the body as I can that act as my global styles. And then I run through and start doing my typography, and then I get into layout. Now, if you want to approach that in a different way, by all means, you can. I just find for me, it's the way that makes the most sense. So on my body, and I'm going to forget one thing here on purpose, so maybe you'll notice what it is as I go through all of this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my font size right away because we know we need that to be 18. And actually, I need my font family to be Lato as well. And I missed something, which is if I go back to my index, I also need to link to that Google font, which I have right here already in my clipboard. So you'll notice that in my link here to the Google font, it is getting the 400 and the 900. So I did have to go to that customize screen in Google Fonts to be able to get that. So just make sure you got both font weights when you did that or when you're getting something from Google. If you forgot the customize step, it's possible the bold fonts don't actually render as bold. So now, because we are linking to the font, that means we can also come in and actually use that font. So there we go. We have my Lato in there. And well, it's really not the most obvious thing. The dark text in the white section actually had that dark color that I used as a background color as well. The 2E35-4F was the that dark blue color that's in my header, and that section 2 background color is actually the font color in this section. Is this necessary? No. Did you leave it as black? Maybe, and it really doesn't matter. But I'm going to set it up that way because I had it, and I'm going to set it up here instead of in section 1. Now, if I had a bigger site that had a whole bunch of sections, I'm going to assume that anything with a white background actually had that color as the font color. So that's sort of my logic there, that I want that as sort of the default in case something doesn't have a background color on it. So let's go take a look. And so there we go. It's already looking a lot better. So now we can get into our typography. So let's come in and do my H1. So the font size on that font size is 36 pixels. Now, what a lot of you probably did was also set your color here to FFF or white, because that's what I meant. If we look at it, we can see that it is the white color. I'm actually going to only put that color when I do my header. I'm going to set that as the font color for that section. The same way on my section here, I'm going to set the white as the font color for that entire section. If you put it for the H1, it's perfectly fine. It works. There's no problem with it. I like trying to be as generic as possible. The same way I try and put a font color on my body and just have that work in as many places as possible, I'm thinking the same way when I'm doing my layouts. I'm going to try not to put colors or be overly specific with styles on my type unless I need to. And one place I need to is on my H2s, because my H2, the font color is different from the paragraphs that are with it. We don't have a paragraph or anything else that's with it here. So honestly, if you put it on the H1 or if you put it on your header, it's like a tit for a tat. At the end of the day, in a layout like this, it really doesn't make a difference one way or the other. I'm just going to show you the way I like to work. So for my H2, I need the font size of 24 pixels as well as the color of EF5839. Now, one thing that's interesting before I move on to any more typography is the headings are obviously bold. And if I look here, the bold font weight is coming through, and it's also showing up on my strong tag here, even though we haven't told it which font weight to use, because it's automatically jumping to the 900 because that's the only one that's available that's more bold than my regular text. If we want to be explicit though, and we want to make sure that that font is the right font weight, because maybe somebody has Lato installed on their computer, and it's possible it chooses a different font weight than 900. It'll probably go to 800, which is the default bold in that case, because it's available to that person because it's actually installed on their computer. So we can be explicit. Now, I'm assuming you didn't do this when you set things up, because you didn't think you needed to. And I'm being very, very specific here by including the font weight on these two, because it's not something you have to do, but I like being as specific as I can when I'm doing my CSS to make sure that the page is rendering exactly how I want it to for anybody who's visiting my site. Now, one thing I am doing here is I am repeating myself for the font weight 2 times. So if you can think of a better way of doing it without creating a class or anything like that, I would go ahead and modify this, because I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to remove these from here and make it on one selector instead of having to repeat myself over 2 selectors. So either you said it in your head and you said, Kevin, you can comma separate them, or you did it yourself. Either way, that's awesome. So here I can do my font weight of 900. Now, nothing will actually change in my design, so we won't go take a look at it. I'm going to put this on a separate line, though, because I'm actually going to take that extra step of also saying my strong should be using that. And just to actually show you why we can do this, so I'm explicitly stating a strong tag should be using a font weight of 900. Strong by default is making things bold, but we can change that behavior. So if I went and switched this all to 400, and then I came to look at my design, you'll actually see my strong isn't bold anymore because I've changed that default style. And my headings, which were bold by default, they're no longer bold because I'm explicitly stating what font weight they should be. So if ever you do need to overwrite any of these, you can. Just be really careful, because if you're overwriting strong, there should be a pretty good reason for it. Usually it's because you're making something more bold and not less bold, like I just did now. So let's set those back up to 900 and keep going with this. And let's come down to my A. So my A has the same color as my H2. Now, you might be saying this is a good candidate for something like this, and you'd probably be right, to be honest with you, because they are both using the same color and I am repeating myself. This is the one exception where I don't tend to comma separate and include my link in something else, because I like having my link styles sort of grouped together, because with my link, I also have my A hover. And if you did this as an A link, and if you did other styles as well, like the visited and the active, that's awesome. But because I have my regular link style, and I tend just to do the A like that to cover all my bases and then overwrite the ones I want to, which would also include my focus. Because I am making these styles, I like grouping all of this together. And for that reason, I'm not grouping my H2 and my A together for their color property. Am I repeating myself? Yes. Should I be? Probably not. But, sometimes you might do stuff like that. And it's to say that when you're writing your CSS, if it's not exactly perfect and as optimal as absolutely possible, it's probably not the end of the world if it's well organized and easy for you to get around and work with. So for this, I'm going to say the color, I used a color picker just to get to this this other number, which is more of a yellowy color. If you used anything whatsoever, I did mention that the colors I gave don't really work really well. So if you found another color, whether it's a keyword or used a color picker, or you just came up with something on your own, anything is good as long as we had some sort of hover and focus state on there. So let's go and see what those look like. And there we go. So it's not a really big shift, but it's enough to really indicate that it is definitely changing, and it should be visible enough on the light and the dark background to work well. All right, so we can keep going. I think that is all my typography. So now we can start getting into some layout stuff. So if you want, and I always say we should, I'm going to make a typography up here. And now I'll come down and put in layout here, because we're working on our layout now. So what we can do in my layout is let's start with the header. And I don't have a lot that I need to do on my header, but we do have a few things on here. So I'm going to do a background, which is that dark blue color. And we want to give it a little bit of padding. Now, I'm not going to put any padding on the left and the right. I'm only going to give it padding on the top and the bottom to control this space, because this space here is going to be controlled by that container div that I created. And we're going to get there eventually. Don't worry if you're a little bit confused by it still. So the padding on the top and the bottom, I'm going to go 45 pixels. If you did something else, that's fine. And 0 on the left and the right, just like that. And as I said, I'm also going to put my color on here of FFF or white to control my text color, because I like trying to do as much of the coloring of text on the layout section so it is inherited by the children as possible. Now, there will be a problem here, and we have a couple problems actually. One of them is right now we have this white border that's going all the way around. The other one that we have is this is way more than 45 pixels. So both of these problems involve margins on 2 different elements. So if you know the solution to that, go into here and fix it. And if you're not sure what it is, I'm going to do it in 1 second. All right, so the first thing is that white border that's going all the way around the edge of the page, and that is coming from the body. We've looked at it a couple of times. That is the default margin that bodies always have, so very often we'll be setting it to 0. So if we look at it now, we can see that that margin has disappeared and we don't have a margin anywhere along our page anymore, and our text is even touching all the way around. So that is the first thing. Now the other one is the margins that are here on this text. So I've set padding of 45, but this is a lot bigger than 45 pixels. So what I'm also going to do is I'm going to go on my H1 and I'm going to set the margin to 0. The reason I'm doing 0 all the way around is because I want to control this padding. I want that to be the size on the top and the bottom. I don't want to have to worry about adding padding to the margin, because then I have two different numbers that I have to play with to try and get the number perfect. So by putting this to 0, I know I'm dealing with exactly what I want here, and now I actually have the right spacing with what I'm trying to go for. So I'm very happy with that. So now we can move down to section 1. Section 1 does not have a lot. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to literally set a width on here. So let's just say width is 620 pixels, because I told you that's how big it should be. And we're going to come back and change this a bit afterward. And so now we can say section 1 has the width of 620 pixels, and it has the margin of 0 auto. I should put that on this header as well. As I said, we're going to come through and change all of this in a second. But I just want to sort of go from where we were to adding in this new container and how it works and why we bother with the container. So we have the width of 620, the margin of 0 auto, and I'm going to give it padding of 45 pixels top and bottom, and 0 on the left and the right. And let's go take a look. So we can see this is being held in the middle of the screen. This is being held in the middle of the screen. So that's perfect. I have my total width. Everything is looking good. And that padding is giving me this space here and this space underneath. I could go and give my H2s a margin top of 0 just to really control that space on the top. If you want to go through that step, you can. For this layout, I'm not too concerned with it. But if I do find the spacing is off, I might go back in and make that change. We can move down to section 2 now. So let's go down to section 2. And once again, we're going to need all of that same stuff. So what I'm actually going to do, and this is often what you're going to see yourself doing in coding, is you notice that you're repeating yourself in your code over and over again, and that's when you make the change. When you're first planning things out, you might not realize that's going to happen, but now I go, well, I just need to rewrite all this same code over again. So I could do a comma separator here and do my section 2, or just like everything, my top is in a header, everything else was in a section selector. So I could just delete all of that. And this is my generic section. All my sections will have the same width, the same margin, the same padding, so they're consistent. And then if I need to change one of them, section 2, I can give it the background, which is my dark background color, and I can give it the color of white. I'll just add some spaces there. You don't need a space after your colon. I just find it makes it a lot cleaner and easier to look at, and it's sort of the standard. And we go and look. It's starting to come together and it's starting to look like the layout that we want it to. So that's really, really good. We're almost there. So I'm going to go and do the buttons next. So here I had the layout. So I'm going to copy that comment, come down to here and put buttons. And what we're going to do here is I have my generic button selector. So if you forgot this part, that's all right. But we need to do the display inline block on my button. We also need to give that the padding. So my padding, I'm going to go with 10 pixels top and bottom, 25 pixels left and right, but that might change once I see what it looks like. I'm going to do the text declaration of none to get rid of the underline that was on the link. Then I'm going to come down and say that I have my button accent. That has the background of that color, and it has a color of white. And then I had my button white, which was effectively the same thing, but the background color on that one was my white color, and this color here was the dark color. I also wanted hover states for these, so I want to just come down btn accent hover. And what I'm going to do is just choose the same color that I'd put on it as my link, as the link hover effect. I'm going to use that as my background color here. So the background will change to that color. And my white button, what I'm actually going to do for the hover on that one is I'm just going to invert the two colors. So this will become my color, and this one here will become my background. If you came up with other colors or other ways of doing it, it's perfectly fine. But the one thing I always like to do when I'm doing it is first I group all my buttons together all the time. And if this makes more sense for you, and I'd usually actually do this, my buttons would be up with my typography. So I'd have all my typography, then my buttons, because they're sort of being used everywhere, and then I'd get into my layouts. So I have my button, which is my generic one, at the top, because that's controlling all of my buttons. Then I'm going to style with the colors for my accent one, and what the hover for my accent is. Then I'm going to do my white, and then the hover for my white. If you think it makes more sense to have your accent and then your white and then do both hover effects, as long as you're consistent, you're saying here's all my default styles, then here's all my hover styles, then that's fine too. I just find it easier to keep the sort of this one button all together and then my next button all together. So let's go and take a look at what that looks like. And there we go. They look pretty good. I have my hover. I put a dark background on that, but I guess that was a bit of a mistake. I wasn't thinking about that when I got to there. So let's go and fix that a little bit. And so my button accent, let's give this a color of our dark color so we can actually see the text in it. Instead of that dark background on here, what I think I'll do, it was white. Let's give it I'm going to give it 999, which is like a light gray. So it should be enough that it shifts. And this will actually become my dark color as well, because I think I'm going to need to keep the text dark on that. So let's go and take a look at what this looks like. There we go. That one is much better. And that one is working as well. And I guess the text could be white or dark. It's a bit hard to read the text, so maybe I'll white color, but that's good enough for now. So pretty much everything is done. If you got this far on your own and your site looked like this, you're a champion. You were able to do everything that we've learned so far throughout this course, and you've got it to work. So that is really, really, really amazing. Now, what I'm going to save for the next video is the solution to this sort of challenge that I put in this, which was getting these background colors to extend out to the two sides. But what I'm going to do before we go on to that video is give you a bit of a hint. And what that hint is all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the padding off of this. I'm going to leave my padding on my section here, but this margin and width I'm going to take off of the section. I'm going to put it on a different selector. I want you to see if you can figure out what selector I'm going to put it on and to test it out and try it out on your own to see if it works. And then in the next video, I'll give the solution to it and explain it a little bit. So it is a solution time to the challenge, and we want to stretch these backgrounds out. If you got it, congratulations. It's not the most intuitive way to work necessarily, but you're really going to get used to it because we're going to be doing something like this all the time. And that is, if we go and look at my markup again, I have my header, then I have a container, and then I have my H1. My section with a container, and then my content inside, and then my section 2 with a container and all of my content inside of there. The word container is really common. You're going to see it used a lot if you look at how other people write their code. The other word people use for this is wrapper. They're really the two most common names for this type of generic element that contains our content. Because one problem with a website is there's no page size. If you go into a piece of software like Photoshop and you make a new document, it's going to ask you how big you want it. We don't get that because different people have different browser windows. We can use the container to control the size of our content a little bit. So again, it's container wrapper, or you might see other people coming up with their own names, but those are the two most common. And so because everything is wrapped inside the container, I'm going to use that to set the width and lock it in place and allow other things to be full size. So what we can do is we want to take any reference to width and margin out of wherever we've put them. So I'm going to take it out of the section. And I didn't mention it in the last video, but we also have that over here in the header. So we're going to take it out of both of those. And then I can come and say my container. Remember, it has a dot in front of it because it is a class. And the container is going to have the width and the margin on it. And now we can come back and take a look. And we can see we have the background that stretches the whole size. But as I resize this, my content is still being held in the middle of the page. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come in here and give this a border so we can see it. 2 pixels, solid magenta. So it's just like in my design that I shared with you. And it helps illustrate a little bit what's going on. So this magenta box is the container. So those containers are holding the content. They're holding the content to control the total width of the content and to place it in the middle of the page, even though the parent is going full size. So this is how we start getting into modern layouts. And it's a really, really common concept. And we're going to be using this a lot. So obviously at the end, we want to turn off the border because the border does not look nice. It ruins the entire design. So we can turn it off and we can just have this nice layout that looks like a nice modern layout of a website. There are a few things that we might want to add to it, but overall, we're definitely going in the right direction. So you should be super proud of making it this far. We've covered a lot more material. You're making a lot of progress, and before you jump into it and before you start doing anything, please take a little bit of a break before you go into the next module of this course, because we have covered a lot of material, and if you just keep adding and adding and adding, it's not just going to start sinking in. So hopefully you're able to get through this project. If you struggled with it at all, I'd actually suggest going and trying to do it all from scratch without watching what I did again, to make sure that all of these ideas and all of these concepts are starting to cement in. There's no shame and there's no trouble in going back over a project to make sure you understand it, or going through and doing it with your own text, your own images, and all of that, just so it's a little bit different. You can choose your own colors, your own fonts, and play around with it a little bit. But don't just focus on driving through the course to finish the course. You're here, you paid for this course, you're focusing on trying to learn this the most you can. So it's not just about going to the next lesson as fast as possible. It's making sure you understand everything you have and taking breaks. So take a break, come back tomorrow, go back through this last lesson to make sure you understand it properly. Because in the next module, we're going to be learning how to start thinking responsively. And that is not the easiest thing to be doing. We're not taking a really big jump from what we learned in this one. There's a little bit less CSS. It's more about new units that we're going to be incorporating in, as well as just a bit of a mindset shift instead of focused on a fixed width, on how to work with something that's growing and shrinking, and a whole bunch of interesting stuff like that going on. But once again, be proud of where you are now. You've made a lot of progress. Take that break, enjoy, have a little drink or celebration, and show off to people what you're able to do now, because you should be really proud of it. And then I'll be seeing you in the coming days when you're ready to start the next module of this course and to start thinking responsively.
Hi there, this is Per from Scrimba here again. Now that you have your CSS fundamentals in place, you are actually ready to start joining our weekly coding challenges. So on your dashboard, you will regularly see new challenges pop up in this widget right here. And these can be all kinds of fun little things that you can build in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. For example, this social media for cats, Cat Basket. And the creator of these challenges is Leanne from Scrimba. She actually has a show on YouTube where she launches these challenges and looks at all of the submissions from the community for the previous week's challenge. And you'll get to vote for a winner who gets a prize. So this is a lot of fun. And if you can't solve the challenge, no worries. Leanne and Michael actually hosts a live stream where they solve the challenge as well. Now, you'll of course find announcements of challenges and live streams in the announcements channel over at Discord. But if you want this straight into your inbox, I would recommend you to click this image right here. That'll take you to the weekly Web Dev Challenge landing page where you'll see all of the challenges. And when you enroll into this course, you're automatically added to an email list so that you'll get the challenge every week straight into your inbox. So this is a great way of continually practicing your skills, giving you a little bit of variety, and also being more active in the Scrimba community. So click this link and get yourself onto that email list, and then you can continue on with the career path.